If you watch enough videos on how to make coffee, you'll find that just about everyone is using fancy coffee scales like these to measure things. We are no different. We often talk about espresso recipes and brew ratios in grams. And the truth is, some people find it all a bit too much. Perhaps they can't afford expensive coffee scales, or they can't bring themselves to perform complex mathematics before their morning coffee. Whatever the reason, today I'm going to show you a couple of old school tips to consistently get tasty espresso without scales. Hey, it's Josh from the Coffee Science and Education Centre at 7 Miles. Before we get into the details, it's worth asking the question, why measure coffee at all? After all, most people just start out by throwing in some coffee and water and hoping for the best. The problem with guessing is that sometimes you'll get tasty results and other times the coffee just won't taste right at all and you'll have no idea why. So using some sort of quality control can go a long way to making your morning coffee consistently tasty rather than just a complete gamble. Now, even though in today's video we're talking about old school ways to measure coffee, I'll point out that digital scales really are hard to beat if you're serious about getting the best out of your coffee. They're fast, precise, and can help reduce the amount of wasted coffee. But I get it. At home, sometimes you don't have all the fancy gear and you're really craving that caffeine fix. Before timer-based grinders became popular in cafes, baristas would often measure the dose by overfilling the portafilter and then swiping the excess back into the grinder or into a container. While it's pretty rare to see this technique still used in Australian cafes, it can be a helpful solution for making coffee at home. So we did perform a few tests on this technique to see what works best. Here are a couple of tips we found that will help you get consistent results. First, grind just enough to make a mound above the filter. Next, you collapse with a simple tap on the bench or on the forks of the grinder. With this tap, it's important to try and collapse with the same technique every time. If you vary this part of the process, then you won't get a consistent measure of coffee in the handle. Finally, you swipe off the excess either with a lid, a card, or anything with a flat, sharp edge really. Okay, maybe not that one. Either way, what matters here is that you're going to keep this technique consistent to maintain the same dose of coffee every time. The exact amount of coffee you'll get will vary depending on the size and shape of the basket that you're using, as well as how dark that coffee is roasted. For example, using this method of dosing coffee, we ended up with a 13% difference in having more coffee when using a light roast compared to the same process using a dark roasted coffee. That comes down to the difference in density between these blends inside a group handle. All these variables mean that we can't just give you a blanket number for exactly what dose you'll get using this particular method for the coffee that you're using at home. So if you do happen to even have a basic set of kitchen scales, then it's a good idea to use them at least once to check and adjust your technique for the coffee blend that you're using. Then they can go back to collecting dust in the drawer, like mine. Of course, the downside with this collapse and swipe method is that you do end up with some excess coffee that you either need to save for the next shot or it ends up as waste. Next, we need an accurate way to measure the liquid espresso. The traditional method of measuring espresso shots is to use a shot glass. The trouble with measuring espresso by volume is that the beautiful golden crema. It looks great in slow motion, but these beautiful clouds of dissolved carbon dioxide make it really hard to work out the exact volume of liquid espresso as it separates. If you do leave a shot of espresso to sit for just a hot minute, then that crema will float to the surface and you can see the liquid volume clearly. Of course, by then it's too late to adjust the volume. So sure, you could say close enough is good enough, and that is that if you're happy with the results. But for those looking for something more precise, this is where our espresso recipes are based on weight rather than volume, because it's faster and more accurate than trying to estimate the liquid volume in a shot glass as it is flowing. Still, scales aren't the only option if we want consistent results. One solution is to program your machine to dispense a specific volume of water every time. Most modern espresso machines will have what is known as a flow meter. This is basically a little water wheel that measures the amount of water that the machine will pump through to the ground coffee. Ironically, you're more likely to find this sort of control method in more affordable home machines by brands like Breville or DeLonghi, whereas some of the more expensive machines like this La Marzocco Linea Mini only has an automatic brewing control without the program. But for the machines that have programmable buttons, you can program the flow meter to dispense a certain amount of water each time one of those buttons is pressed. So you could have a single shot, a double shot, ristretto shots, all the shots. The programming process is different on every machine. So check the manual for exactly which buttons you need to press to get the machine into programming mode. Once the machine is in programming mode, lock in some of that fresh coffee and hit the brew. With scales, this part of the process is easy. You just wait for just before your target weight and then press the button again to lock in the program volume. But without scales, you'll need to eyeball it, which is going to take a little bit of trial and error with all those espresso drips happening at the end of the shot to get exactly the measure that you're aiming for. Once you have the volume set, the flow meter will now dispense a predictable amount of water onto the coffee bed. So even though the shots may look longer or shorter, depending on the freshness of the coffee or changing the grind size, you will still maintain a consistent ratio of coffee to water. One final note on this. If you want to convert a weight-based espresso recipe to volume, then make sure you measure the volume of the liquid part of the espresso only, so that part just underneath the crema. For example, for this coffee, to make a double shot, we recommend 21 grams of ground coffee to brewing 38 grams of liquid espresso. 38 grams of espresso equals almost exactly 38 mils of the liquid part of the espresso. So to get accurate results, you'll need to wait for the crema to separate and then check the volume in the measuring glass. Okay, that's all for this time around, but till next time, stay stoked, enjoy the good coffees.